The knockout stage of the Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge has begun. So we've got quarterfinals, 2 games played in each match. I want to take you through the game between Fabiano Caruana and Dommaraju Gukesh. I think this game displays everything that's interesting about freestyle chess, or Fischer random chess as we normally know it. So let's take a look at the baseline, and in some ways this could develop into quite a regular position, because if this knight comes out to f3 and we castle, then that's quite a regular setup. It's not so radically different from normal chess. Also, the bishops stand on the long diagonal already. Usually that's where you want the bishops to be. So let's see how things develop. c4. So staking a claim in the center, but also potentially letting this bishop out here. e5. Okay, so we've got some imbalance already, but it looks a little like an English or a reversed Sicilian. b4. So that lets this bishop into the game. So both bishops looking, well, they have some perspective anyway. Knight f6, yeah, looking quite regular actually. Knight f3. Attacking the pawn, d6 and b5. So Caruana content to just gain some space with this b pawn, and it's looking very much like an English. b6. So that lets this bishop into the game. Castles and castles. e3. So the pieces are in slightly strange positions, but structurally this is a very familiar kind of English or a reversed closed Sicilian position, with these pawns here and the pawn here and these pawns here. But there are some odd placements of the pieces, these bishops and the knights. The knights in particular actually are very odd, and the queens too. So will it sort of work out? Let's see. Knight e7. Right, that makes a lot of sense. The knight's doing nothing on c8, and it spins round here into the game. Caruana could improve the position of this knight by playing, for example, a4 strikes me as a decent option, in order to put the knight to a2 and then b4. Typical situation from an English. But instead he goes for d4. And I think that's what's interesting about this form of chess. I'm reluctant to call it freestyle chess or Fischer random anyway. Is that, the positions are slightly different, and of course you have to use your judgment, but it's difficult to get it right because you're not relying on computer preparation. This is a very typical move, of course. You stake a claim in the center. Nice pawn chain. Is it good in this particular position? Well, e4 played, attacking the knight spins back, and d5. So actually, again, we have a very typical position. This is a very well-known pawn structure. It looks like a reversed French defense. You can see f2, e3, d4, this typical French structure. Normally we would see it on f7, e6, d5. It's just colours reversed. And black is cramping white with these pawns here. And this is a source of tension, these pawns here. But this doesn't feel quite as nice for white as some other positions, typical positions, because there's no pressure down the c-file. This knight gets in the way. It really is a problem, that knight. So it slows down white's counterplay. a4 played by Caruana to support this pawn. Okay, looks reasonable. c6. So breaking things open, putting a little bit of pressure here. And also, and this is really important, bishop is doing nothing on the back rank. If it comes to c7, then it's looking at h2. So absolutely typical. And normally in the French defense, when you're playing against the French defense, if you can bring this bishop to this diagonal, imagine a bishop on d3 striking down here, it's the same, exactly the same, then this is extremely dangerous for white's king. So that's why Caruana hastens to bring this knight over to the king's side. Knight g6, very good. So Gukesh is using the space advantage that he's carved out with these central pawns to start an attack on white's king. This is very dangerous, with potentially a knight coming here, bishop coming to c7. Knight g3, so Caruana needs to defend. Gukesh exchanges on c4 and then on b5 and plays the bishop to c7. Well, I would take black every time in this position. So this bishop is doing a good job of controlling d5 and supporting the pawn on e4. This bishop is on a great diagonal. The knights also look very strong as well. So it's gone wrong for Caruana. He didn't judge the break with d4 correctly, and he's got a difficult position. So let's see. Knight d2. So trying to put a bit of pressure here, but perhaps just making room for that bishop to enter the game on b3. Queen e6. So the queen steps off the back rank and connects to rooks. Looks good. Also supports the d5 square. Very important blockading square. Bishop b3. Attacks the queen. Bishop d5. Black is in control. This is a beautiful position. And such a typical position. You know, although we started out with an odd, a strange position, an alien position at the start of the game, we've reached something which is very, very typical, and a glance at the position tells me black simply stands really well. Great blockade and really great pieces on the king side as well. The queen also doesn't look good on e1. It's breaking communication between the rooks. Caruana exchanged, and he played f4. So he's worried about that bishop. Could have played f3, but you know, there's a lot of pressure here. But actually after this exchange, well, black maintains the blockade here. You can see that bishop on a1 blocked in behind the pawn on d4. Black is doing really well here. Again, absolutely typical position. So we got this position. Caruana went for f4 to block out that bishop. And this is such a typical decision to make when you're fighting against the French. This is basically a French structure. You have to think, do I leave this pawn here or do I exchange off? Gukesh decides to leave the pawn and play rook c8, and he's got a good position. So what about exchanging? Could you do this? Because this keeps that bishop nice and active. What's going on here? This is also very pleasant for black, because after this, rook e8. In fact, white's king is rather insecure here. Yes, this is a huge centre. If you can get this rolling, then could be good for white. But here, well, black's pieces are so well placed on the king side. This is still very unpleasant for white. So, for example, d5, knight h5, where you can see there's so much pressure on that knight. And this square can be occupied as well. Or e5, knight d5, great blockading piece. That bishop is dead. So that would have been pretty good for black. But Gukesh, after a bit of a think, played rook c8. Also very good for black. Knight e2. Yep, the knight's doing nothing now and potentially spins around here. Knight e7. Good move. So, he is in control here. If he can bring a knight to f5 or perhaps d5, it's still looking good for black. Rook b3. Interesting move. Maybe preparing to bring the queen over with some pressure here. Maybe switching here at some point. Queen e6 played. Looking to just establish that knight on the beautiful blockading square. And if that knight gets there, things look really good for black. Didn't need to do that. Gukesh could have just played rook e8 and then knight f5. And this looks really attractive for black. Typical blockade. Perhaps we'll play the h-pawn forward. But he went for queen e6. And Caruana appreciated that he has a really narrow window of opportunity here. If that knight reaches here, fantastic position for black. Very little counterplay for white. So Caruana decided, fine, I've got to give up that pawn just to get the bishop working. Now, how do you take that pawn? Well, if queen takes, clearly that gives white some counterplay. Knight c3 and so on. Knight f takes d5 is perhaps the way to go, because that knight still covers the c6 square, because that knight looks to hop in, and also it allows the queen to go to g6, and that's still a very active square. But Gukesh went for knight e takes d5, and that gave Caruana just a little bit of play with that knight hopping in here. Queen g3, well, there's definite counterplay here. So, well, you can imagine, with the queen on g6, obviously something like this just wouldn't be possible. So Caruana has succeeded in just complicating the situation. Rook e8, good move, protecting the pawn. Knight c6, yeah, looks scary. In fact, black is still in the driving seat here. Bishop d6, good move, looking to activate and attack that weak pawn on e3. So there are pros and cons to getting rid of that pawn here. Knight c4, bishop c5, excellent. These pieces looking good. h3, so that covers the g4 square. And this is still tricky with the queen and the bishop bearing down on the g7 square. Now, Gukesh played king f8, perhaps a very understandable move, stepping out of the queen's attack. But the king isn't completely safe on f8. It's still exposed potentially on this diagonal. And in fact, he could have just played a6, undermining this knight. And in fact, white really doesn't have any way to exploit the pressure with the queen and bishop. Black is still doing very well here. But king f8, an understandable move, but now it's not so clear. Rook b1. Again, a6 is still possible, but maybe the most practical way for black to play, because they were both running a little short of time here, is just to give up the exchange, because that clarifies the position. It's going to be a lot easier for black to play when you don't have those two knights dancing around in the position. And besides, black now has, let me see, knight and two pawns against a rook. So it's a rough material balance. But because these minor pieces are so well placed, well, you'd have to give black the nod here. Let's go back. Queen f5 played in the game. Bishop e5, really nice move. So there's a potential threat to check here, and then there's going to be a fork on d6. That's why rook e6 was played. But can you see how black's pieces kind of tread on each other's toes here? And the rooks are now split. As we know, that is a cardinal sin. And look at white's pieces. You know, white is beautifully coordinated here. All of white's pieces really active. You know, there's pressure all over the place. As I've pointed out, you know, there could be a threat to take here and break through on g7. This is now much trickier for black to play than white. Queen g6 played, very understandable. Gukesh seeks exchanges, but Caruana is having none of it. Queen f2, steps back, f5 threatened. Therefore, queen h6. But that queen is really sidelined. Knight d4, good move. Attacking the rook. If it drops back, then knight f5. Oof, that's really nasty. And bishop takes knight. Played, again understandable, but that's quite a prize to get rid of that dark squared bishop as there was pressure here. And you can see, well, again, white's pieces are beautifully coordinated and all really active. Okay, these pieces aren't so active yet, but okay, let's just give it a moment. Knight e8, covering the d6 square, very understandable. Rook takes knight, an exchange of pieces, but white is in control here. Queen a2, hitting the rook, hitting a7. The rook came back, rook d7. This looks really unpleasant now, with the queen and rook bearing down on f7. This queen is completely blindsided. It's very unpleasant for black now. It's just impossible to coordinate successfully. Queen h5 covers here, but also looking perhaps to get some counterplay down into white's position. Queen takes pawn. Well, the queen isn't moving for the time being because f7 needs protection. Rook c2. Caruana confessed after the game that he'd overlooked or underestimated this move, but in fact, after rook f2, everything is fine. The rook covers the d1 square, there's no danger there. And yeah, black's pieces just can't do anything. And very important, the king has a nice flight square on h2 where it's completely safe. Rook takes f2, king takes f2, queen still completely out of play. f6, well, it's really hard to find any good move for black here. Black is lost. No coordination. White's piece is absolutely beautiful. f6. And Caruana was very sharp here. He spotted the finish very, very quickly, actually. You know, he was in some time pressure, but he spotted this. Okay, I'll hand it over to you. White to play and win. You can see that that 7th rank is now exposed, which doesn't help matters. And, well, I won't say anything more. You have a think, I'll have a drink. Cheers, folks. White to play and win. Queen a3 check. Black is not only exposed on the 7th rank, but on these diagonals too. That's what happens when you advance an f-pawn. King g8, queen b3. 1-0. That's the end of the game. How do you defend the rook? Impossible. Possible to do it successfully. If queen f5, g4. End of game. Well, I thought that was a fascinating game. You know, a real struggle where Caruana found himself in great difficulties out of the opening. He just misjudged this position after d5. Hang on. Yeah, this position. Basically, black is doing very well here. But he fought back, and Gukesh gave him a chance here with the queen stepping back, and d5. Now, this does not give white the advantage. Black is still better here. But it randomized the position. And after a couple of inaccuracies, suddenly it's not so clear And yeah, this was, turns out, the big mistake, but black was already under some pressure. And Caruana dealt with things really nicely so that by the time it got to this position, in fact, white is already doing extremely well. Very well fought by Caruana. It's not easy against the younger generation, but he had the better of Gukesh today. Right, what happened in the rest of the games? Remember, these are mini matches of 2 classical games. And in that first one, we see Caruana takes the lead. Abdusatorov defeated Ding. Poor guy. Ding again struggled at a very early stage in the game. Ali Reza Firuzja defeated Magnus Carlsen. Very smooth game. Carlsen is in trouble. And Vincent Keimer and Levon Aronian drew their game. So let's see what happens tomorrow. But yeah, Ding, Carlsen and Gukesh are in trouble. They need to hit back with a win. Before I go, let me tell you that there's a Chessable sale on at the moment. So if you're interested in my courses on the Sicilian Kalashnikov and Anti-Sicilians for Black, complete repertoire for Black, then do check them out. Also, my courses on How Good Is Your Chess? If you want to rate your standard of play, there are 2 courses there, How Good Is Your Chess 1 and 2. So do check it out. I'll put the link to Chessable in the description and also in the comments as well. Thanks for watching.